The establishment in 1949 of the DDR, that's East Germany you'll remember, formally created a socialist German state inside the Soviet sphere of influence. It's easy to then fall into the trap that from that point until the fall of the Berlin Wall 40 years later, that all members of East German society were firm and loyal supporters of the communist SED government, or at least that there wasn't a tremendous opposition to the SED. The fact that there was indeed opposition and in fact an open revolt can often be overlooked. Before the Prague Spring and even before the Hungarian Revolution, there was the East German Uprising of 1953. What, you've never really heard of it? Don't feel bad, lots of people haven't. I'm your host David, and that's right, today we are going to talk about the 1953 East German Uprising. This is Cold War. Shout out to Magellan TV, who is kindly sponsoring this episode. Magellan is an incredible streaming service run by filmmakers that have over 2,000 documentaries. We've been working our way through Magellan's current history documentaries playlist, and the current documentary we're on is called North Korea Hidden Revolution. These documentaries do a great job of highlighting all different aspects of modern history and are recommended to the fans of the Cold War era. You can stream the documentaries anywhere from your phone, laptop, tablet, or TV. Many new programs are added on a weekly basis, and a wide selection are available in 4K without any additional costs. If you haven't tried out Magellan yet, you have to give it a try at magellantv.com/Cold War for a free 1-month membership trial. The division of Germany in the wake of the Second World War resulted in two very different countries, each pursuing very different ends. Each was aligned to a larger political and economic alliance from which they drew their support. East Germany, controlled by the SED and pursuing the goals of state socialism, was widely considered a satellite of the Soviet Union and very much under the thumb of Moscow. West Germany, for its part, was integrating its economy to the capitalist West, and boosted by aid from the Marshall Plan, was enjoying large-scale economic growth. By the early 1950s, the economic gap between the FDR and the DDR was widening significantly, resulting in the so-called Republikflucht, the mass migration of Germans from the east to the west. Keep in mind, at this point in time, there was no physical barrier, no wall, separating the two countries. Slipping across the border was simply a matter of walking. So at this point, it's well worth exploring why there was such a widening gap between the economic situation in the two countries. The first reason was simple. The economy of Eastern Germany, which had long specialized in producing consumer goods, had lost access to its primary market, Western Germany. They'd also lost access to their main source of industrial goods, which they had used to produce those consumer goods in the first place. The second reason for the lagging East German economy is related to the first one, which makes sense, as the traditional consumer goods industry was being forced to convert to heavy industry. This was done at the insistence of the Soviet Union and was well in line with Soviet demands being made in other East Bloc nations. The third reason was that, unlike West Germany, which was receiving cash infusions from Marshall Plan to help boost its economy, East Germany was being forced to pay reparations to the Soviet Union. These reparations came in the form of the confiscation of what heavy industry there was, or by means of the formation of joint German-Soviet enterprises, where revenues were claimed by the Soviet part of the venture. It's been estimated that between 1946 and 1953, East Germany paid an astonishing $14 billion to the USSR, either directly or indirectly. By 1949, 100% of the East German automotive industry, between 90 and 100% of the chemicals industries, and 93% of the fuel industry were under Soviet control. By 1952, when military commitments also demanded by the Soviets were added to these industrial reparations, a full 20% of the East German budget was consumed. So we have a stagnating East German economy. The response to this from Walter Ulbricht, leader of the SED and therefore the DDR, was the announcement that a fully socialist economy would be systematically introduced. For those of you who may not know what that means, it was the introduction of a fully planned economy. Along with this came the announcement of increased work quotas, which in practice meant that workers had to produce more, but for the same salary. Coupled with this was that workers would receive less salary if the new higher quotas were not met. Also introduced at the same time was a package of higher taxes and higher prices for goods. Put simply, this all hurt the overall welfare of a citizen in East Germany. These changes were all set to take effect on June 30th, 1953, Walter Ulbricht's birthday. Happy birthday, Guinness at Ulbricht. Now, it's important to point out that early 1953 saw a massive change in the Soviet Union, which of course had massive repercussions throughout its allied nations. I am of course referring to the death of Stalin. No, not the movie. Although the movie is great, you really should go check it out. What I am referring to is of course the actual death of Joseph Stalin and the leadership change that occurred afterwards. In June of 1953, this new Soviet leadership invited the top SED members to Moscow. Ostensibly, it was done to foster new relations between the new leaders of the Soviet Union, as well as demonstrate that the two countries formed a partnership of equality between two independent nations. However, the reality was slightly different. Or totally different, really. The Soviets were concerned over the mass exodus of East Germans to the West and the disruption it was causing the East German economy. Malenkov even referred to economic impact as a catastrophe. So, with these concerns in mind, the Soviets imposed a change of policy in the DDR. They called for an end to the forced collectivization of agriculture and even an end against the war on private enterprise. They also called for a revision of the plans for heavy industry and a relaxation on political judicial controls and regimentation, including the persecution of the Protestant churches. Lastly, the Soviet revision included a promise of substantial aid and relief in German reparation payments. Under these new guidelines, the SED announced the Neuer Kurs, or New Course, in June. Included in the new course was a general amnesty for all East German refugees, assistance to small and medium private enterprises, a relaxation on interzonal travel residency permits, as well as a reissuing of ration cards to those in the middle class. It should be pointed out that the work quota, however, was not actually revised, leaving the working class with higher quotas for the same pay. That aside, if you think that these changes would have helped ease resentment and anger in the DDR, well, you'd be wrong. Not only were workers still upset, but now the SED was being viewed as weak and politically bankrupt as a result of such a drastic about-face in policy. There's just no making some people happy. And just how did these unhappy people react? Well, like a French farmer who just found out that the price of wine and baguettes was going up. The people took to the streets in protest. Strikes broke out across the DDR in places such as Eisleben, Fürstenwald, and Chemnitz-Borna. By June 16th, the protests had spread to Berlin as hundreds of construction workers marched from Stalinallee towards the Alexanderplatz. That crowd grew from hundreds to tens of thousands as the day progressed. At first, the slogans and shouts from the crowd were economic in nature. "We are workers, not slaves," and "We demand the reduction of work quotas." However, as the protest grew, the calls became more political, turning against the government. The Volkspolizei quickly lost any control over the protest. With over 20,000 people gathered, the demands for Ulbricht and Grothwohl, the prime minister, to address the crowd grew. The SED leadership, desperate to regain control of the situation, announced over loudspeakers the decision to annul the increased work quotas. But by that point, the crowd wanted far more, desiring real political change. Calls for a general strike were circulating around Berlin, and there were reports of government officials being attacked in their cars. Propaganda posters, common across the city, were being torn down. A revolution seems to have begun that the state security apparatus was just unable to contain. On the morning of the 17th of June, more than 40,000 protesters gathered in East Berlin, calling for the resignation of the SED government and for free elections to be held. The SED response was swift and unflinching in the face of these demonstrations. They requested the intervention of Soviet troops stationed in East Berlin, and tanks rolled into the streets. The protesters, unarmed, stood no chance. It's estimated that anywhere between 55 and 125 people were killed as the protests were forcibly put down, while thousands more were arrested. Between 20 and 40 people were executed for their roles in the protests, including, interestingly, some Soviet troops for their unwillingness to obey orders in suppressing the revolt. Of course, these protests weren't only confined to Berlin. Demonstrations broke out across the DDR in almost all major cities, including Dresden, Leipzig, Frankfurt an der Oder, Falkensee, Magdeburg, and Halle. Protesters tore down government propaganda, released prisoners from jails, and in some cases, like in Halle, Wolfen, Merseburg, and other towns, organizations were formed that even took over executive power in the region. In Bitterfeld, the committee even demanded from the central government the formation of a provisional government composed of revolutionary workers. The Soviet army, as you can expect, crushed these protests as well, although government controls were not firmly re-established everywhere until as late as June 24th. Okay, so open revolt happens. It's forcibly crushed. Then what happens? Well, the East German government responded with a propaganda campaign blaming West German provocateurs for causing the disruption to public order. A disruption which, of course, true East German workers did not join. Was there any truth to this, though? Well, there's nothing to suggest that there was any deliberate action from the West Germans or their allies to foment a revolt. An internal SED report put some blame on Western propaganda, namely RIAS, Radio in the American Sector, for highlighting the gap in living standards between East and West, as well as generally spreading information regarding the protests as they happened, creating the impression that the strikes of the construction workers were becoming a broad movement among the entire population. Maybe a bit of a tail wagging the dog situation? The reaction in West Germany was one of inaction. Although arming the protesters was briefly contemplated by the Chancellor Adenauer, nothing further was done for fear of destabilizing the security situation. Nobody wanted to risk war between East and West. And finally, what happened in East Germany? Generally, the East German citizenry lost any faith they had in the SED and its legitimacy. Hundreds of workers across the DDR resigned from the party. Ulbricht, as head of the SED, lost much of his support on the Central Committee and only managed to retain his position because of turmoil in Moscow. Set to be removed from office with the support of hardliners in Moscow, the arrest of Lavrenti Beria at the end of June set a new path. The changed Soviet leadership felt consistency in East Germany was more important, and instead of Ulbricht being removed, the hardliners in the SED were forced out instead. In the long term, the state police, more commonly known as the Stasi, expanded dramatically their monitoring of the people, especially workers, looking to avoid a repeat of the 1953 uprising. While the new course policies were followed through on, improving the overall quality of life in the DDR, the East German people took the lesson that open revolt would be met by force, and it wouldn't happen again until 1989. We all know the different results that happened then. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.